You walked into that room and every single cell in your body told you that everyone stopped, stared, and silently formed an opinion about you before you even opened your mouth. Your heartbeat climbed, your palms went damp. You replayed your entrance in your mind like a courtroom prosecution, cataloging every awkward detail. The way you stumbled slightly at the door, the way your voice cracked when you said hello, the way your hands had absolutely nowhere comfortable to go. You were utterly convinced that every person in that space had clocked every flaw, filed it away, and would be discussing it later over dinner. And here's what your brain never told you. None of that was real. Not a single frame of that invisible courtroom drama was grounded in fact. It was a performance your mind staged entirely on its own, cast with an audience that was never actually watching. This is not a self-help opinion. This is not motivational guesswork dressed up in confident language. This is documented, peer-reviewed, laboratory-tested cognitive science, and it has a name. Psychologists Thomas Gilovich and Kenneth Savitsky at Cornell University spent years studying this exact phenomenon, running experiment after experiment to measure the enormous gap between how much people believe others notice them and how much others actually do. What they discovered dismantled something most humans carry like invisible weight every single day of their social lives. They called it the spotlight effect. The deeply human, deeply irrational tendency to believe that a bright, burning spotlight is following your every move in social situations, illuminating your mistakes, your appearance, your nerves, and your failures for a captive and judgmental audience that in reality is far too absorbed in their own internal spotlight to ever truly focus on yours. The research is striking in its clarity. In one landmark study, participants were asked to wear a t-shirt bearing an embarrassing image before entering a room full of other people. Those participants estimated that nearly 50% of the people in the room would notice and remember the shirt. The actual number was less than half of that estimate, consistently across repeated trials, across different groups, across different social scenarios. The spotlight they felt burning on their backs existed almost entirely inside their own minds. And yet that imagined spotlight was powerful enough to shape their behavior, shrink their confidence, alter their posture, cloud their speech, and quietly convince them that social participation carried a risk far greater than reality ever actually supported. This is where the science gets personal, because this is not a rare psychological quirk limited to the anxious or the introverted. The spotlight effect operates inside the minds of executives, artists, parents, students, and leaders across every walk of life. It is a universal cognitive distortion, a factory setting of the human brain. And if you have ever hesitated to speak in a meeting, avoided a social gathering, or replayed an interaction on a loop at 2 a.m, convincing yourself that everyone remembers your worst moment, then this science is speaking directly and personally to you. Now here is where the story deepens, and where the science stops being merely fascinating and starts being something far more urgent, because understanding that the spotlight effect exists is only the first layer of what is actually happening inside your brain during these moments of social terror. The real question, the one that neuroscience has been quietly and methodically answering, is why? Why does a brain that is sophisticated enough to compose symphonies, build civilizations, and solve equations that fill entire whiteboards also insist with absolute conviction that a stranger across a crowded room is mentally cataloging the fact that you mispronounced a word 7 minutes ago? The answer lives inside a structure called the medial prefrontal cortex, a region of the brain that neuroscientists have identified as the headquarters of self-referential thinking, the place where your brain processes everything related to you, your identity, your reputation, and your social standing. This region is not calm. It is not rational. It is ancient, evolutionary, and it was designed for a world where social rejection did not simply mean embarrassment, it meant expulsion from the tribe. And expulsion from the tribe in the world your brain was built for meant death. Your brain's threat detection system, the amygdala, does not distinguish cleanly between a predator in the wilderness and a room full of colleagues who might be forming a negative opinion of your presentation skills. It registers both as danger, it floods your system with cortisol, it narrows your thinking, it pulls every ounce of your cognitive attention inward toward self-monitoring, toward damage assessment, toward the exhausting and relentless task of managing an audience that your prefrontal cortex invented and your amygdala decided to fear. And this is the part that nobody warns you about, the part that sits in the middle of the science like a locked door behind which something genuinely unsettling waits. The very act of intense self-monitoring, the hyper-awareness that the spotlight effect produces, actually degrades your social performance in measurable, documented ways. Researchers have demonstrated repeatedly that when individuals become consumed by self-focused attention in social settings, their ability to read the room collapses, their conversational fluency drops, their body language becomes rigid and missilig. Ned and the very awkwardness they are desperately trying to conceal becomes more visible, not because people are watching more closely, but because authentic human connection requires cognitive resources that self-consciousness has already redirected entirely toward an imaginary audience. You are not just suffering emotionally inside this loop. You are being neurologically hijacked. Your brain has essentially staged a coup against your social confidence using evidence it fabricated, fear it inherited from ancestors who lived in a completely different world, and a spotlight that was never real to begin with. And the most quietly devastating part of all of this is that most people carry this distortion for decades without ever once questioning whether the audience in their head bears any resemblance whatsoever to the people actually standing in the room. The science says it does not. And that gap, that enormous, liberating, life-changing gap between perception and reality, is precisely where your transformation begins. So now you know the enemy, you have seen its architecture, you have walked through the neuroscience of why your brain constructs this elaborate and punishing fiction, and now comes the part that actually changes your life. Because knowledge without application is simply a more sophisticated form of staying stuck. The research does not just diagnose the spotlight effect, it also maps the precise pathways out of it. And those pathways are not built from positive affirmations whispered into a mirror or vague encouragement to simply believe in yourself more. They are built from evidence, from repetition, from deliberate neurological rewiring that anyone willing to do the work can access starting today. The first technique is called perspective-taking recalibration, and it is grounded directly in Gilovich and Savitsky's own recommendations following NIE, our landmark research. It works like this. The next time you feel the spotlight burning, you pause and you deliberately redirect your attention outward by asking yourself one precise question: what is the person in front of me actually thinking about right now? Not what are they thinking about you, what are they thinking about themselves? Because the research confirms with overwhelming consistency that every person in every room is running their own internal spotlight, managing their own imaginary audience, rehearsing their own private courtroom drama. The moment you genuinely internalize that truth, the spotlight over your head dims instantly and measurably because you have replaced self-referential fear with accurate, data-backed social awareness. The second technique is exposure desensitization through intentional visibility, a method supported by decades of cognitive behavioral research demonstrating that the brain's threat response weakens significantly when the perceived threat is encountered repeatedly without the catastrophic outcome the amygdala predicted. In practical terms, this means you deliberately place yourself in the social situations your spotlight effect tells you to avoid. You speak up in the meeting, you introduce yourself first at the gathering, you wear the metaphorical embarrassing t-shirt, and each time the world fails to end, each time the audience fails to react with the horror your brain promised, your medial prefrontal cortex quietly updates its threat assessment, and the grip of the spotlight effect loosens by a degree. Over time, those degrees become freedom. The third technique is what behavioral scientists call narrative reauthoring, and this is the one that carries the unmistakable energy of what MS. Shonda Rhimes has spoken about so powerfully in her own journey, the radical, deliberate act of rewriting the story your fear tell, asks you about who you are in a room. MS, Shonda R. Rhimes, did not build an empire of storytelling by allowing the spotlight of self-doubt to author her narrative. She understood, with the clarity that only intentional self-leadership produces, that the story running inside your head is not a documentary. It is a first draft, and first drafts are always meant to be rewritten. Narrative reauthoring asks you to consciously replace the fear-based internal story. Everyone is watching, everyone is judging, everyone sees every flaw, with a story anchored in what the science actually confirms, that people are absorbed in themselves, that your mistakes are forgotten faster than you will ever believe, and that the social confidence you are waiting to feel is not a gift that arrives when conditions are perfect. It is a decision you make in the presence of imperfection, repeatedly, until your brain rewires itself around the truth instead of the fiction. Your brain has been lying to you, and now you know exactly how, exactly why, and exactly what to do about it. The invisible audience was never real. The spotlight was never yours alone. And the version of you that walks into every room with quiet, grounded, data-backed assurance has been waiting on the other side of the science all along.